Now we're confronted with something which NICAP is trying to break up and to overturn, and that is the policy of censorship by the military, which, among other things, reaches into many lines of endeavor, but it is directed, or has been, the aspect of it that we're fighting, of keeping the public from knowing what's going on in the field of these unidentified flying objects. Now this stemmed from the fact that they swarmed over Washington in July and August of 1952. And it also stems from the fact that we have not been able to cope with these things, and somewhere somebody up in the upper levels of our military decided that rather than tell the public that there's something up there they can't cope with, we'll tell the public that there's nothing up there, while all the time we are working and trying to find out some means to counteract them. As you have seen from one of those, that UFOs are serious business document. They regard it seriously. They're trying to combat them. Let me point out an example of how this censorship and suppression works. On the night of April 18th, 1962, a glowing red object appeared over New York State, over Oneida, New York. It was seen by a ground watchers group there. They reported it to the nearest air base. They got it on radar. They began tracking it. It was at very high altitude, at that time somewhere between 75 and 100 miles. It was moving southwestward and rather slowly. It was tracked all the way across the middle part of the country to Gridley, Kansas, where it changed course, went up over Nebraska and Wyoming and part of Colorado, and then it or a similar object landed beside a power station at Eureka, Nevada. The power station went out of business. Coincidence, probably. But while this thing was on the ground there by the power station was out of operation. It was out of operation for about 42 minutes, according to the Air Defense Command. That gave the Air Defense Command, which was in quite a flap as a result of this thing, it gave them time to get up a flight of armed jet interceptors from the base at Phoenix and another from Stead Field at Reno. They were vectored in on this thing, which had in the meantime taken off from near the power station. The power station came back into operation. The object took off after the object took off, and then the power station came back into business. Then the jets were vectored in on this object. It was then totally dark. They were chasing it westward across Nevada when the thing exploded in flight about 70 miles south of Reno, and the flash was so brilliant that it was seen over 5 states. Scientists out there who saw the flash said this appeared to be an atomic explosion. Neither the Strategic Air Command nor the Air Defense Command nor the Air Force would say whether they had shot at this thing. They would only say that the jets were being vectored in on it when it exploded.
Stan, in December of 1965, you were part of an investigation that has gone down in UFO history as one of the most significant UFO events. Actually, I've been told it's in the top 5 cases in the United States. So tell us what happened in Kecksburg and across the state in December of 1965.
Well, I was 16 years old when that event happened. And I remember that night very well. It was a Thursday night. And I was tuned into KDK radio in Pittsburgh because they had a radio show called Contact. And the host of the show was Mike Levine. And he had a guest on. His name was Frank Edwards, who was a radio announcer who had written some books on unusual occurrences. And he was in Pittsburgh to talk about that subject. And interestingly, almost the entire program was focused on this UFO incident that had happened just a short time before, and the news was just breaking on this event. And the news was talking about the fact that this brilliant fireball was seen from the tip of Ontario, Canada, over Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. It occurred in the Pittsburgh area about 4:47 p.m. It was just about dark. And there were multiple reports of this object over the greater Pittsburgh area. So the radio, TV, newspaper, police departments were being overwhelmed with calls from the public reporting seeing this fiery object. Some people thought it was an aircraft that was on fire. And as the evening continued on, more and more information was coming in. They were beginning to read the newswire stories that were breaking, interviewing eyewitnesses. It was a major news story all around Pittsburgh that evening. And hundreds of people, after hearing those radio and TV broadcasts, began to descend into Westmoreland County into that small farming community at Kecksburg to try to get a look for what was reported to have been a UFO that had fallen in the woods near that community. And there wasn't a lot of information, just the fact that people seen this fiery object. But what made things very intriguing that evening, as they're breaking on Pittsburgh area TV and radio, is that the military was now arriving in that small farming community to search for an unidentified flying object. So I wasn't even driving yet, but I was already interested in UFOs for many years before. I started in 1959 when I was 10 years old. So I've just marked 55 years of research, and it'll be 50 years next year. It's going to be 50 years since the Kecksburg incident happened. And we have learned a lot about the case we didn't know at the time, because initially there was very little information on it. I began to investigate the case basically from that day and the next day, but there was very few names in the paper, very little contacts with people in that area who knew anything about it. But I began to keep records on the information as time went on over weeks and months and years. I began to get a lot more information from those who were involved. I would get leads from relatives and neighbors or friends of people who were involved that night. By the 1980s, I had a significant amount of information on the case, which suggested that there was a lot more to the story than we had heard officially, because the next day, this story is making not only local news, but national news. So the AP, the UPI, all the local newspapers, it was the headline story, the front page story in many of the local papers. But the official explanation was the next day that people had been mistaken. They had seen a bright meteor in the sky, but nothing had fallen. And I remember very well within days after it happened, there was a lot of talk around the community that people had seen a large military flatbed tractor trailer truck carrying a large tarp object out of the area late that night at a high rate of speed. But that was never in the newspapers. And as time went on, I was able to put a lot of the story together, what really took place. So now we know a lot more than we did at that time. So what we now know is that this object, whatever it was moving relatively slowly. It was making change in the direction along its path. And when it fell near Kecksburg, it made a slow descent. In fact, witnesses said that it was moving about the speed of a small aircraft on approach to an airport. When it went down into the woods, it did not come down at a high rate of speed. That would be similar to, for example, re-entry of space debris or a meteor, but it came down almost like it was controlled. Nobody reported any parachutes. So what we now know is that some local people independently went down into the woods soon after it fell to see what had come down from the sky.
How big of an impact site was there when this object landed or crashed?
You know, I call this a UFO crash landing because the witnesses saw it go down. It crashed through the woods and knocked over trees,
Okay.
but the object was completely intact.
Okay.
So except for the damage which we, in the mid-1980s, as we're intensifying our investigation, we find what appears to be a trajectory in that wooded area. A series of trees that have been knocked down the same direction, top of trees knocked out, and we felt that we had a pretty good idea where this thing probably fell. But it wasn't until 1987 that we had our first eyewitness to an object on the ground in 1965.
Okay, but if it was a meteor, like people say, my experience in researching meteors is they enter the atmosphere at about 30,000 miles an hour and they impact at 3,000 miles an hour. Was there a huge divot, almost like Flight 93, where you could just see a gigantic hole?
Definitely not.
Yeah, so, okay.
No, definitely not. It was a very narrow area for what we could tell. And except for the tree damage in the area, and the witness saying there was tree damage and the object was semi-buried in the ground, it was completely intact. That was pretty much the damage in the area.
Okay. Yeah. Now, tell us about what's the atmosphere in 1965? Like, I know there was a lot of black and white B movies on UFOs, The Thing, Invaders from Space, etc. I mean, it's a small town, 6-7 miles south of Greensburg. What was kind of the atmosphere at that time? How knowledgeable were people about the UFO reality?
Well, of course, you didn't have the TV shows like we have today. And again, yes, we had a lot of the science fiction movies back in those days, but there was a lot of ridicule back in those days with the UFO subject. And again, dealing with this case, you know, we didn't really locate a lot of people at that immediate time. It was, again, weeks and months and years later that we began to find so many different people. Of the hundreds of people I've now interviewed about the case, even today, the high percentage of those people have never gone public. You got to remember, a lot of those witnesses back then were young children and teenagers. Well, a lot of them grew up to be educators, police officers, and CEOs. And even today, many of those people are still alive, and for various reasons they don't want to go public. What was so intriguing was interviewing all these people over so many different years, from so many different locations, people not knowing each other, and yet a lot of them were able to give me those little details.
At the site when it occurred, was anyone warned not to speak about this? Were they ushered out of the area? Was anyone threatened like we hear on so many of these cases?
Well, what we have found is that, you know, this is a large wooded area, okay, and it's dark by the time this occurs now, and the people are coming in, it's dark. And a lot of people came in that night because they wanted to try to get down into the woods to see what had fallen. Well, what you got to remember is you had hundreds of civilians that came in that were lined up along those small, narrow little country roads that night, but you also had reporters from all of the major Pittsburgh area radio, newspaper, and TV who were on the scene, and they became witnesses themselves. Okay. Because some of them saw military equipment, some interacted with the military. Okay, they wanted to get out into the woods, but they were prevented from doing so. One reporter, for example, Bob Gaddy from the Tribune Review, he was convinced something was down there. He wanted to go down, and they told him you couldn't get down. He said, well, what if I get down? He said, you'll be arrested. Another guy at the scene was told that if you don't leave the area, we'll confiscate your car. There were other witnesses, most of them were kids, teenagers at the time, who tried to get down to the impact site and were stopped by armed military personnel. And in some cases, apparently soldiers aimed their weapons at civilians. So here you have the military coming in to other people's private property, and they're preventing other people from going on other people's private property from going down into the woods further to the impact site. So what was down there was so secretive and so important that the military didn't want the public to see. The point is, they couldn't control everybody because there were hundreds of people involved. That was a big area. There were a lot of people came in before they got there, but they didn't know that, okay? And then there was others who were involved. We have heard various stories over the years, interviewed different people. There were certain people that at some level were threatened apparently, but they couldn't get to the majority of people. They had no way to control it.
Did any of the witnesses actually get to the site, see the object? Did any of them get down in there and actually see it?
Oh yes. Oh yeah.
Okay.
We talked to people who were standing a few feet away from it.
Okay. What did it look like? What was it?
Well, the first witness we found was when I was holding a big public National UFO Information Week display at the Westmoreland Mall in Greensburg. It brought thousands of people in. And we had a small display on Kecksburg at the time because there was some information, not a lot. And one of my associates was there talking to another person, and the man and his family happened to walk by and they're listening in, and the guy says, excuse me, but are you talking about that incident in Kecksburg? And they said, yeah, and he said, I was on the search team that found the object. Well, that turned out to be Jim Romansky.
Okay.
All right, so he told us right away, he said, look, I don't want to get publicly involved, I want my family involved, but he said, yes, I'll be glad to talk to you. So we made arrangements to meet with him. He was not from Kecksburg. His story was he was a volunteer fireman from another volunteer fireman in Westmoreland County that was called out to assist other fire departments to search for a possible downed aircraft in the Kecksburg area. And he remembered a lot of details from that night. He remembered how they loaded them in trucks and they were going to set up a grid search in that large wooded area, and how these guys went up in groups. They had walkie-talkies with them, and they weren't out there that long when they got a radio call that another group had found the object. So they hurried over, and they're standing on a little embankment only a few feet away, standing and looking down at this large metallic acorn-shaped object semi-buried in the ground. So this thing is approximately 10 to 12 feet or more in length, about 8 to 10 feet in diameter. But as the witness said, now this fellow had been a machinist almost all his life. And he told me when I interviewed him, he said, look, he said, this looked like somebody took a liquid metal and poured it into an acorn-shaped mold. It looked like a big, solid, kind of an off-gold bronze color acorn. But there's no rivets, there's no weld marks, there's no seams, there's no wings, there's no fuselage, there's no windows. But on the raised up back like you would have on an acorn. What he called the bumper area, some people call it the ring area. There were these very detailed, what appeared to be raised up symbols. And he spent years in libraries looking up ancient languages, and he said the closest thing he could remember would be ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now, again, this thing's completely intact. There was no parachutes people reported at the scene. And if you look anything at that time that the United States, the Soviets, or others were building, well, they weren't really that neat looking. They looked, I mean, you can see a lot of rivets and weld marks and seams on them, okay? And so there's a lot of questions, and we've uncovered so much more information about what happened out there.
Wasn't there supposed to have been NASA people out there?
Okay, well, what was interesting is witnesses on the scene that night. I've interviewed many, many people who were there over the years independently, and interviewed many, many reporters who were on the scene, and various people all confirmed that it's both an Army and Air Force presence. But there were some individuals I talked to who said they either had direct contact or saw what appeared to be NASA personnel as well.
Isn't there a Fourth Amendment that you're not supposed to do these things?
Well, the interesting thing is when these military people were coming in their homes, and it's a small house, it was a small little house, but they were in little groups whispering and talking, and they asked the parents to send the kids upstairs. Well, little John decided he was going to make an excuse and say he had to go to the bathroom a lot because he wanted to see the soldiers and the people in his home. So he's making these trips up and down the steps. He heard a phone conversation that indicated that NASA would be arriving soon. And he said it wasn't long after that he heard a knock on the door, and here's guys in white coveralls. He said one of them had a clear NASA patch on. And so it's one of many, many different accounts we have from so many different people what happened that night.
Tell us about some of the information that came out years later. Wasn't there also someone who talked about Wright-Patterson Air Force Base?
Well,
what was the deal with that?
Well, in the summer of 1990, before I did the season premiere for the Unsolved Mysteries TV show on the case, a man approached me. I was able to check out his background, his information. And he said, look, he said, I was a part of the Air Force Security Police that guarded the object when it came in from Pennsylvania during the early morning hours of December 10th at Lockbourne Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio. And what was interesting was there was another person he didn't know who confirmed the story to me. And they both told me how they brought that flatbed tractor trailer with the tarp object into the base through an entrance they didn't normally use. They backed it into a hangar, but they set up a security perimeter around the hangar, and they were given a shoot-to-kill order to anybody approach that hangar without the proper authority. Now, he told me, this fellow told me, he said, I didn't stay on the team that much longer, but he said, I heard that truck and its cargo continued on to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Now, after the Unsolved Mysteries show aired, I had multitudes of new leads on the case. And one fellow contacted me, his name was Myron, he's now deceased, and he said, I guess I'm allowed to talk to you about it now because it's on television. Well, Myron went on to tell me, and this went into a very detailed investigation, worked very closely with the late Len Stringfield, who was a very well-known researcher in UFOs, and we worked together for many years. And anyhow, what he went on to tell me was that a Navy officer, and a lot of people don't know this, but the Navy was the first agency that showed up early in the Kecksburg investigation, okay? Mm-hmm. And a Navy officer came to the supply house. They ordered a large supply of a special type of glazed engineering brick to be delivered to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So this is approximately 2 to 3 days after the object fell in Pennsylvania and came in Ohio. Okay. What he said was he was there the day before, Myron was there, and the flatbed trailer was outside the warehouse with the tarped object on it, and to him he said it looked like a big Liberty Bell, just from the shape you could see from the tarp. The next day, he and Myron deliver 2 truckloads of these bricks to the base, and they're escorted in by a high-ranking officer and some military, and they're told, just do your job, don't be looking around, just unload your bricks. Well, and by that, the next day, by the way, the flatbed where the object was not outside anymore, okay? So anyhow, as the day goes on, Myron is curious because he sees these guys in white coveralls with sidearms and taking various type of protective gear off, and they're occasionally changing their outer clothing, and he's wondering what's going on in there. So when he didn't see anybody around, he runs over and looks inside this big warehouse building, and up on scaffolding, here's this big metallic acorn-shaped object with the hieroglyphic markings on it. There's ladders going up, there's guys on the ladder, and they're apparently trying to get inside this thing. And apparently he started asking some questions. They must have thought at first he had clearance, and then they realized he didn't. And he's told me, he said he was threatened. And they told him, for example, without going into all of it, that forget about everything you've seen. If you don't, we're going to throw you in jail and throw away the keys. But in 20 years, this will all be public knowledge. And of course, that never happened. Okay. And there's more to that story, too, which gets even stranger and stranger.
Did he see something else while he was in there?
Yeah.
On a gurney? Was there something else important to this story?
Well, yeah, there was. It's interesting. It's something that's come up, and now there's some other information from other sources which kind of maybe confirms this. Okay. And it brings you to a whole new element of the case.
Which is?
Which is, well, when I was filming my documentary, Kecksburg Untold Story, so this is maybe 1996, he was not in good health. I went out to interview him. He was on oxygen, and he was in not a good physical condition. And he told me, he said, I have something else to tell you I haven't told you before. And he said, I talked about it with my son the night before. And he said, why are you getting bothered and telling me? He said, because I may not be around tomorrow. And he is now deceased. And he told me, he said, there was something else I saw inside the building that I didn't tell you before. He said, I saw a workbench. And it wasn't lit really well in there. It wasn't lit very well. But he said, there was a body on the workbench. It was covered by a white sheet. And I believe, from my memory, it's like 4.5 to 5 feet tall, somewhere in that range. And all he could see, though, was the left arm hanging down from the table. He could see 3 digits, 3 fingers, and he said the skin looked lizard-like. And I tried many times to try to get him to change the story, to exaggerate the story more, and he said, that's all I could see, that's all I could see. Wow. And then, and it would take a lot of time to get into some of these other details, but in 2002, when the Sci-Fi Channel decided to do a very detailed investigation of the Kecksburg case, and they did a lot of investigation, were able to get in some areas I could not. We got another lead, just to make the story short, of a fellow whose name had come up to my attention maybe 13 years before. But when we contacted him, he said, I can't get involved, I'm afraid to get involved, I'm afraid the government may come after me. He didn't deny it, he just didn't want to talk. Well, then I see his name show up, and I make arrangements to interview him right away. And just to make the story short, he reportedly was down in the woods, and we heard this from more than one person, now was hiding down there in the early stages as civilians come in, then the military comes into the woods. He's at the site, and he's hiding in the trees, in the thick trees down there. And he's watching everything that goes on. And he goes on to tell me a lot of details of what happened that night, but the one thing was, he's describing the object, he's telling me how soldiers are now at the scene, there's a high-ranking military officer that jumps on top of the object. And he has a long metal rod or something. He said, almost like a policeman's billy club, but different. And he said, I'm watching this guy, and he said, all of a sudden, he strikes that object with that billy club. And he said, all of a sudden, a hatch opens up from the front of the object, from right to left. And you, as I'm interviewing him, and I take the interviews, you could hear his demeanor change. He said, I swear to God, sir, there was something inside of that thing. But all he could see from where he was, he said, it was like some kind of a material that his kids used to play with when they were young. It was elastic material, and he said, all I could see was this very long, almost like elastic-like arm came up behind the back of the hatch. And he could just see 2 digits. And he said, there would have to be another arm, but I couldn't see it from my position. And he said, in a matter of seconds, that hatch, you could hit it hitting metal on metal. And the officer was screaming, hurry up, we don't have much time. Then he went into great detail how they used metal strapping to strap this thing, how they had to winch it over to the flatbed truck because they couldn't bring the trucks down to the site because of the trees, and how they lifted onto the flatbed. And that's interesting. Then another little tidbit from one of the witnesses was Bill Weaver, who was a very credible witness. Bill was a teenager that night, riding around the area, had his radio on, was listening to the local WHJB radio broadcast, and they were breaking in with this news that something had reportedly fallen not far away in Kecksburg. So like so many people, he drives over. And he finds himself on this little farmland. Well, this little dirt farmland was important because it was way on the opposite side of where The hillside was where hundreds of the people were, which overlooked that area. And they thought the object fell right there, but it didn't. It fell way over on the opposite side, closer to this farmer's lane. Well, it was on the farmer's lane where most of the activity and military activity was taking place. And Bill's story, among other details that night, was the fact that he was there when this big unmarked white panel truck pulls up. Out of that panel truck come 4 men in moon suits, so like some type of biological protective gear. And they took from out of the truck a box-shaped device, maybe 4 by 5 square on a stretcher-like device, and they took it down into the wooded ravine towards the crash site. Now that, and we believe there may have been 2 of those from what we got from other witnesses, it was too small of a container for the object, so what were they going to put in that container? And there's other little tidbits that came up over there.
This is an absolutely incredible incident with a lot of detail. How many total witnesses would you say there
I've
are
lost track.
to
I've lost track.
Give me a
Hundreds.
ballpark.
Hundreds.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
hundreds.
Well, you know, this is a case we're going to have to continue talking about in another episode. So we will continue this in episode 2 of Kecksburg. That's our show for this week. Be sure to look for our part 2 of our special program featuring Stan Gordon, and visit www.mufonpa.com for more information. I'm John Ventry. Thanks for watching.
And the full story with all the details I've given you, plus a few others. Now, when I say that there is censorship on this thing, I don't think it originates with the Air Force, because it covers all of our military services, every one of them. Therefore, this has to be an order from the very top in the Defense Department. Now, how could any organization, how could any agency of the government decide what is going to be carried on the news and what is not going to be? This is called managed news. It's not all managed by the government. You can see there an example of where one of the news wires did a little news managing on their own. They refused to carry the story. So the newspapers didn't have a chance in that particular case. Now, if these things didn't exist, there would be no necessity for the censorship. But the regulations are on the books, JANEP 146B, AFR 200-2, and others. There are the censorship regulations on the book forbidding government personnel, military and otherwise, to make any public statements on this subject. There is evidence right there that the things do exist. But the censorship restrictions are there. Now, if the things do exist, as the censorship regulations indicate, and there is censorship, then it must be because somebody has decided that these things present a problem to us, and that for some reason or other the American public is not entitled or not fit to know what the problem is.
Stan, there was an interesting fact about Frank Edwards that I think we need to bring out. Frank Edwards in 1967 attended the World UFO Conference in New York City. He was planning to go public with Major Kehoe on a number of these UFO facts that he wanted brought out to the public at this conference. And mysteriously, he dies that morning. He has a heart attack in the hotel and passes away the morning of the World UFO Conference. I always found that to be very odd, and it's a long list of ufologists that seem to pass away prematurely. And it's interesting that he was actually in Pittsburgh the night of Kecksburg, or at least on the radio, of KDKA. But just a strange passing of Frank Edwards, who was an advocate for UFOs. So let's continue with talking about Kecksburg. There's a lot more details that we can bring up. Fred, did you want to ask?
Yeah, Stan, I mean, you had, the military got there pretty quick.
Yes.
Do you think they was watching on radar, or what do you think happened there that they knew?
Officially, they were not tracking on radar.
Okay.
However, unofficially, various sources I talked to over the years told me, yes, indeed, it had been tracked for quite a distance. They had a pretty good general idea where it was coming down. So apparently, those units had already been activated to begin to move towards Pennsylvania, but they didn't know exactly where it was coming down. Now, one detail I have found in more recent years, And it took a while before I even talked about it because I didn't have enough verification, but now I do, that apparently there was 1 to 2 military jets from Ohio into Pennsylvania that were pursuing the object. So that may have given a pretty good idea where it had fallen.
Okay.
Stan, now I would think in a case like this, people would have called the police, would have called the state police. Were there any state troopers on site when this was taking place or while the military was there?
Oh yes, there were. I interviewed most of those fellows are deceased.
Okay.
But I interviewed family members and state troopers, who were there.
And I had read, and it may have been in your book, that there was no police reports or state trooper records filed on the Kecksburg incident. Is that true?
I don't believe that to be the case.
Okay.
They only keep the records for a period of time. On non-criminal cases, they only keep them for so long.
Okay.
So a lot of those cases were probably long gone and been destroyed.
Okay. Let's talk about some of the possible explanations. So why couldn't this be a meteor that landed in Kecksburg? Why couldn't it have just been a meteor?
Well, first of all, there were multiple eyewitnesses who saw this thing coming in. And witnesses saw, one witness, for example, was just a few miles away over, maybe not even that far, over towards Norvell that afternoon. And the fellow was out there playing at the time. In the distance, he hears like this hissing sound. And he watches this object coming from the distance, approaching him, moving relatively slowly, passing overhead no more about 200 feet. He sees this large, he said this was a constructed device. And it was kind of a large acorn. He said it was kind of a brownish, grayish color with flames coming out of it, moving very, very slowly. And he watches continue out towards the mountains, towards Laurelville, where other people saw it. So this thing is moving relatively slowly from the multitudes of eyewitnesses along this path. See, what we now know is that this thing came over the city of Greensburg. It made a turn to the south.
Okay.
And it's seen sequentially by people all along those farming communities where it keeps going. It's seen from like Norvell, Marguerite, and it goes out towards the mountains of Laurelville. Then, according to witnesses, it kind of hesitated, apparently made a turn, began to track back towards Kecksburg, made another turn, then dropped down into the Woodard Ravine.
So we know meteors don't make controlled turns.
Direction, exactly.
So we can rule out meteor. Plus, I think the fact that if it was a meteor, would so many military people show up? Would they flatbed out a meteor? Or what's the significance of a meteor?
Well, one thing,
they wouldn't come in to get it, right?
There would have been a lot different type of destruction at the scene. And two, they don't send armed soldiers out to look for meteorites. Okay, that's something the scientists do, the colleges might do, but that wasn't the case.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. All right, now the second, there's really 4 theories on this Kecksburg that I've heard. What about Cosmos 96? What is Cosmos 96? Because some people have said, well, that's all it was. James Holberg, I think, came out from NASA and said it may have been Cosmos 96.
Well, that was always one of the possible origins we thought might have a connection to the case, because coincidentally, Cosmos 96 was a Soviet Venus probe that had a technical malfunction and re-entered the Earth's atmosphere at about 3:18 a.m. over Canada on the same day. This happened about 4:47 in the afternoon. Okay. Now, there's never was any records anybody has found that I'm aware of that this thing was recovered. It re-entered, but wasn't recovered as far as we know. Okay.
And what was the time difference on Cosmos 96?
Well, again,
like 13 hours,
yeah,
I think
right.
it was.
So it's 3:18 in the morning and like 4:47 in the afternoon. And over the years, various news media has done a lot of investigation on this case. And back in the 90s, I believe it was the 90s, they contacted the Soviet embassy. And they confirmed that whatever came down in Kecksburg was not theirs.
Okay.
Later, I had contact with the Russian Space Agency, and I got official verification from them, and they said whatever came down in Kecksburg had no relationship to anything they had launched.
Okay.
Now,
and even NASA, didn't they have someone, I believe his last name was Johnson, who tracked it? That's his job. He tracks it and looks at the trajectory. He even said it couldn't have been because there was a 13-hour difference.
Right. Well, Nicholas Johnson was the chief scientist for orbital debris at Johnson Space Center. But he got involved as a result of the sci-fi investigation and Leslie Kane's investigation with the Coalition for Freedom of Information. So She talked to him among at least one other worldwide expert on the Soviet space program. Now, he was not tracking at the time, but apparently he was able to get in some records a lot of people couldn't.
Okay.
And he pretty much ruled out the fact that Cosmos 96 had any association with the case. And in fact, he indicated that nothing from the United States or any country came down to Pennsylvania that afternoon from the data that he could find.
So we've eliminated meteors and Cosmos 96. Now you mentioned this lawsuit. Just tell us a little bit, how did this lawsuit come about? What was the result of the lawsuit? What happened?
Well, this was a part of, again, the Sci-Fi Channel back in the Coalition for Freedom of Information. They were doing a lot of FOIA requests, and they filed a lawsuit pertaining to NASA's possible involvement because they didn't properly respond to a FOIA request from other information they already had. And basically, to make the story short, the Coalition for Freedom of Information won the case.
So the judge ruled in their favor that
and
NASA...
there was a very detailed search for documents. And I think, from what I understand, that NASA really wanted to find information. They were really looking hard to find it.
What do you mean? They didn't find it?
They found nothing. They found no documents, not even a newspaper clipping pertaining to this case, which made national news, which also brings up some flags. But
so let me get this right. When they were asked about the Roswell case, they couldn't find the box of evidence on Roswell, New Mexico. It disappeared. So they were ordered by a judge to produce the evidence on the Kecksburg case, and they couldn't find the box of evidence.
Well, and again, I was not directly involved in this part of it. Leslie Kane was, and apparently, and she did a final report, which is out there. In fact, I think there's a link on my website that you can read. It's very detailed. But apparently, there were quite a number of boxes of records from that time that were missing. And there were some other records that may have pertained to the case that were signed out, and they never recovered, they never got those cases back, so we're not for sure what was there.
But you see how convenient that is, because most people think the government is inefficient. I personally don't think they are, not when it comes to the Defense Department and the CIA. So the cover is, we're inefficient. We take the important stuff and move it out and say, oops, we lost it. But we're the government. We're not efficient. And that's the cover to this. And it's happened a number of times. This isn't the first 2 times that this has happened.
Let me ask a question real quick here, John. Okay, you said that when, the van came in, the guys had the suits on. Mm-hmm. Okay, you say when they were in the hangar, they had the suits on. Mm-hmm. Okay. Did anybody?
Well, they didn't have the suits on in the hangar. Okay. It was a building. Actually, it wasn't a hangar. It was a big. It was a large building off of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But the guys coming in and out, they were not in protective suits. They had some protective gear like rubber gloves. I remember things like that.
But what my question is, did anybody that you talked to that was there? Were they ever sick or anything? Did they ever mention they got sick or anything from being near the
radiation
object?
poisoning, et cetera?
We can't confirm it, and I can't go into a lot of detail, but at least one person within a year or two after being close to the object began to have various type of problems, which he always associated with the case. Okay. There was a young girl, I got a statement from a family member, I never was able to interview her, this was years later, she died relatively young. She reportedly was one of the first people that ran down into the woods, a young girl, and supposedly touched the object and told the people it was as smooth as glass. And she died relatively young. But if that's associated with it, we can't prove it.
Yeah. What about, there was someone else there, Murphy, a reporter from Greensburg. Yeah. Tell us the Murphy story, because this is interesting.
Well, it's a long story. Okay, John Murphy was the news director of WHJB in Greensburg. And he was out on another incident when he got a radio call to go out to Route 30 East. And he had no idea what they were talking about. Well, then he finally got the word that apparently something had exploded in the sky, but when we got out there, he saw nothing. So he goes back to the station, and at that point, the calls are coming into WHJB. Many, many people reporting seeing this object in the sky. And they spent that whole evening taking calls from the public. And Mabel Baker at the time, she was the office manager. She stayed over to handle the calls, and she said, first, she's getting all these calls from the public reporting this UFO. She thought at first that must be a hoax, and then she realized something's going on. But then she said, as the evening went on, she began to get called from the military, from the Air Force, from the Pentagon. And she said some of these military people wanted exact directions how to get out to the site. So she gave him a special number to call in the event they got lost. And so anyhow, it's after the 6:30 news that they get a call at the station. This was from the mother of a young boy that said she heard about it on the radio, but that whatever that object was, it apparently fell not far from their home near Kecksburg. So John Murphy gets the information, calls the troop-based state police barracks in Greensburg to tell them what was going on, and he takes off. Well,
So he went to the site.
So he went to the site.
Okay.
So he's there about an hour before the state police fire marshal and another investigator arrive on the scene with a small group of people, including the young boy who had seen it and the mother who didn't see the object, but she saw this column of smoke went up in the woods soon after it fell, then it dissipated very quickly. Okay. So anyhow, what I learned from his wife at the time and others who were close to him was the fact that, and he never publicly talked about this, that he apparently went down into the woods and saw the object.
Okay.
Not only did he see it, he took pictures of it.
Where are those pictures?
They've never turned up. Except I talked to, I believe, 2 people who saw him around that time, but they vanished, along with his notes and everything
Was
else
this
he did.
camera taken at the scene?
No, but they took the film out of the camera. Okay.
Same difference.
However, apparently he had one roll of film they didn't get.
Okay.
And more than one person saw that picture. One person told me she remembered seeing like this kind of like this cone-shaped object, dark, surrounded by a lot of trees down in the woods.
Now, he's a reporter.
Yeah.
What did he report on this, and what's
Well-
the story with how that went down?
Well, there's a lot of interesting things that happened. He decided to do a special radio program called Object in the Woods, which was aired about a week after it happened. Interestingly, it was aired in a censored fashion.
What do you mean?
Well, what it means is that some of the people who he had interviewed before it was aired contacted him and said they didn't want their voices on the air or their information given out. One said they were afraid to get in trouble with the Army. The other said they were afraid to get in trouble with the state police. But they aired it in a censored fashion. But what we learned was prior to that being aired and while it's still in production was apparently some government men came into the station to talk to him. They took him to a private room. And you got to remember now, this was a big, big news story. This was his big story. And
The case you live for.
the news story you live for.
Yeah.
He was all gung-ho. And after they left, he was apparently very upset. And he told at least one staff member that they had confiscated some of the voice interviews he did with the witnesses. And after that, it wasn't long after that, as the next week or two is going by, that his demeanor changes and he doesn't even want to talk about it anymore.
Why would you do that if it was a meteor? They said a meteor crashed. Why would all of this happen for a meteor? It doesn't make any sense. All these details prove it wasn't a meteor. So what happens with John Murphy? What happens years later
there's a lot
with
of
John?
things we heard about and whatever. But the
Is
only
he
thing
still
is,
alive?
no,
Can we
of
interview him?
course he's passed away. And he was on vacation in California, and all we can confirm is that he was walking across the road and he was hit by a car and killed. And that's the end of the story. Yeah.
Literally.
But that was almost
The
4
end of
years
the-
later. And
yeah.
I will say, yes, there's a lot of people out there who believe that it was connected, the accident connected to his research. I've never seen any evidence of that. Okay. But it's an interesting
It's
note.
just, but this is the thing that happens. The John Mack hit by a car, Murphy hit by a car. Frank Edwards dies the morning of the World UFO Conference. But there's one more theory, and then we can continue talking about this. But there's a theory, which I know you don't agree with, but it's the Nazi UFO program. And I even put a chapter in my book, UFOs Over Pennsylvania, regarding the Nazi UFO program. And I don't know if the public's interest knows about this or not, but 1937, Germany had a UFO case, a crash in the Black Forest in 1937. And supposedly that's where they started, similar to Roswell, doing the research and back engineering of this craft. And it was called the Vril Project. And it led to the Hanabu series, which was a prototype of an anti-gravity craft. Interestingly, in 1938, Hitler sends his agents to Antarctica, Argentina, Chile, looking for what he believed was the Vrilia Society, another species on this planet that lived under Antarctica, and he sent his SS people out to find them. He did the same thing for the Spear of Destiny, all of those artifacts that he thought were important. Maria Orsic, actually from the Vril Society, had convinced Hitler that he could get a super weapon from this group that lives, almost like the Hollow Earth people that live here. But he believed in it. But what happened was he started what was called the Bell Project, Die Glock, the Bell. And it was done in Czechoslovakia. And what said happened was they take red mercury, they spin it and compress it, and it loses 89% of its gravity. It glows radioactive, and it lifts off the ground. So he figured out how to defy gravity, which is what he believed to be the source of these UFOs. 5 scientists died because they were standing there when this radiation was hitting them. They said not only did it boil the blood and melt the DNA of the scientists' DNA, it also, there were plants, it deleted the chlorophyll and the plants turned blackish gray as though they were 2 years old. So they had something here. And like I said, then what happened when he ordered the killing of 62 scientists, because they were the witnesses, the scientists and actually the workers at the concentration camp at the site were all killed because they were keeping this top secret. And the interesting thing is at the end of World War II, the German U-boats, their submarines are fleeing Europe, heading to South America and Antarctica, and what do you think they're carrying? Red mercury, barrels of red mercury. When we intercept the U-boats, they're carrying red mercury. Why would you be carrying red mercury when you're running for your life? So then the United States, we start Operation Paperclip, which was to gather these German scientists. And they actually went on. They got immunity, jobs. They worked at NASA. They were the beginning of NASA. And they helped us with the rocket technology that got us to the moon. So this is an incredible story. Then a couple years later, in 1946, James Forrestal starts Operation High Jump, sends Admiral Byrd, 13 vessels, an aircraft carrier, 4,700 troops for a 6 to 8 month assignment in Antarctica to figure out if we can put a base there. It lasts 6 weeks. There are casualties. Our fleet leaves, and he gives an interview, Admiral Byrd, in Chile, saying that in case of another war, they have craft that can fly pole to pole, and an attack on the United States may be imminent. So that was the story of the Bell Project, and there are people who say maybe what happened at Kecksburg was not extraterrestrial, but a government program where the United States got the Bell Project from the German scientists, and they were testing this anti-gravity in the Bell Project. So what do you think about that possibility that that's what showed up in Kecksburg?
Well, first of all, we don't know that the object that fell at Kecksburg was extraterrestrial. That's one possibility.
Correct.
And after so many years, we've eliminated a lot of the different theories that were brought to my attention. But there were many theories brought to my attention on what it may have been. I mean, one of the first stories we heard was initially that an Air Force officer told a family who was involved in Kecksburg that a Gemini capsule had been expelled in the area. Well, we learned, of course, that wasn't the case. Another person contacted me and said he was certain it was a projectile fired from a giant gun from a railroad car in Canada. Well, that didn't fit at all. Another guy said he knew for sure it was a Soviet ICBM. Another person said it was a missile. So there are many theories people were brought to me over, and nobody has any evidence for any of these theories when you get down to it. Okay?
And there was no real evidence that the Bell Project was constructed, right?
Exactly.
There is old footage of the test on a small object that did light up and lift off the ground. That's there.
And I'm not sure it came from that particular test.
I mean, but no one has ever proved that this huge Bell thing was constructed, even though there's a site in Czechoslovakia that they believe it was done, a large circular site. So it's a possibility, but there is no real proof that the Bell was put into place, but may have been constructed 20 years later.
It wasn't until they started to do some books on that subject that people began to contact me. And you can have something look similar. There was a lot of Soviet and U.S. probes at that time that were somewhat similar looking. But over the years, I've talked to scientists and NASA design people who worked on the projects of the 60s. They looked at my data and they said, we didn't have anything like that. Okay.
So we've gone through some possibilities, and so it leaves us with, in my mind, really, this thing changed direction. It slowed down. It almost had a controlled, accidental
And it
landing.
came down without parachutes.
Without a
it had
parachute.
But it had a control.
The military showed up. They took this thing out. Some people were threatened. They were told not to talk. It kind of sounds like it was extraterrestrial. It was taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I mean, what other explanation is there for Kecksburg other than it was extraterrestrial? Or some military project we were working on, possibly.
I still say today,
Are there other?
there's a lot of different information we've heard. None of it seems to fit with what we know. So I'd say two things remain. One, it was either some extremely advanced, very secretive man-made space probe that has some type of reentry control capability, very, very advanced from the 1960s, or it's extraterrestrial. There's not too many things left.
Right, I agree with you. There isn't too many other choices. Fred, is there anything else you wanted to ask Stan regarding this case? Have you ever talked to any of the Kecksburg people?
No.
Because we do the conference there in Kecksburg. We do the conference at Westmoreland Community College, and
I don't think there's that many people really around today that were there at the time.
Bill LaBush?
Bill LaBush is still around, and he generally tries to show up at most every year at the UFO Festival.
And he's adamant that this took place.
Oh, there's no doubt.
What was his role in it? What did he see?
Well,
wasn't he like a mechanic and he saw it coming down?
No, not at all. He lived the year after we got, 1987, we got the first witness that saw the thing come down in Kecksburg. That was Jim Romansky.
Okay.
We got to remember now, he was not from Kecksburg. He took us out to the area. We told him nothing about what we knew or about where we found the pattern of tree damage.
Okay.
Okay? He walked around for quite a long time, and he was able to take us to a certain spot. And it was really interesting because it was right in the area where we felt the thing probably fell. A year later, we get a tip. There's a local man named Bill Bush, who lived right over the hill, who saw the object come down and was probably, as far as we know, probably the first person down there. But we can't say that for sure. Anyhow, Bill was out. He was in Mammoth, right over the hill. That afternoon, he was under his dash, tuning up his CB radio.
Okay.
Looks up from the dash and sees this fiery object coming from Norvelt, where a lot of people saw it, going out towards the mountains of Laurelville. He runs out on the road to get a better look at this thing. And he said he watches this thing, and it kind of hesitates, and it makes a turn, begins to track back towards Kecksburg. So he jumps into his car, goes to that high lookout area, which they call that now Media Road, because you can see all over the Kecksburg area. Well, he knew those woods because he hunted down there. It's almost dark.
So we have more. We have another witness.
Oh, and there's other witnesses. Oh,
now,
yeah.
2015 is what? The 50th anniversary of Kecksburg. So I think what you got to look for this year is some real world-class presentations at the Kecksburg Festival in July, at the MUFON conference in November at Westmoreland Community College, because it's the 50th anniversary, and we're going to talk to it. We're going to talk about it further.
And I'm getting many, many requests already to speak in 2015 about the case.
Thanks for being on our show, Stan.
Thanks very much for having me.